also, how many of you are wearing a Christmas gift today? Just 2 or 3? I'm wearing this shirt. It was supposed to be cooler today than it is, so I'm pouring sweat up here, but I'll enjoy it tomorrow, that's for sure. Glad to see you today. Corey and his family are traveling. They have family in Springfield and down in Arkansas, so they're making the family circuit. You remember when you used to have to do that, all you older people? Now you just sit at home and let them come to you, but that's where they are. So we wish them safe travels and look forward to having them back here next week. A week from this coming Wednesday, we're not meeting this Wednesday. A week from this coming Wednesday, we're hosting the Wednesday night dinner. And so that, there's a sign-up list for that on the back table back here. Kathy, where are you? Brenda, would you put the stuff not on the very back table, but up on the one right up here for her? Thank you. It's back there by Chuck. You can put it up on the other table. Sign up for that. Come and join us. $5 for adults, $3 for kids 10 and under. It's a great time. Really appreciate Kathy and Jeannie Beecham taking care of that and doing that. They do a great job for that as well. On the 18th of January, we're hosting a spaghetti lunch. Call it a dinner, but if you're from the South, that means lunch. We're hosting a spaghetti lunch after morning services, and it is a free lunch, quotes, but it is really a fundraiser for our youth group. And we did this last year, and you guys came through in a wonderful way. Not only did you give so much that you were able to help send our teens to Winterfest, but you also gave enough that we have residual money to help fund our mission trip to the children's home. Fairhaven, there you go. The name flew out of my mind there for a moment. So let me give you an idea here of what's going on here. Our teens are going to Winterfest. It's an annual event. It's an extended weekend. They have a great time there. It is a very spiritually uplifting time. It is an event that they really remember throughout the year, and so it has a big impact on them. The problem is it is not a cheap trip. You are hard-pressed to find a good reason to justify spending that much money on a trip if it weren't for the effect that it had on the lives of our young people. And so I told our teens when we put up the sign-up list for them to sign up and attend that, this trip cost, full cost, about $400 a teen. That's rental of a vehicle to travel in and rental of space to sleep over there, and then the event they're going to and all the stuff, and the food, $400 a piece, which we don't want to charge our teens that. We have a policy here at Maryland Heights. Everybody gets to go to whatever event, no matter what their financial ability is, but it's hard-pressed to put out a $400 event, especially for an extended weekend. So we support that partially out of the youth budget that you give to when you give regularly to the box back there online. Your donations help support all our ministries, and part of that is the teen budget line item. But we have $3,000 in our teen budget, which means we would blow the entire teen budget on this one trip, and we want to do other things. So we give you the opportunity to help support them in reducing that cost. They're doing the hard work. They're going to be parents and teens alike. They're going to be preparing the food, setting up the dining room, doing everything that it takes to make that a success. All we ask is you come and enjoy the time together and make a donation to that. So next week we'll have the online link where you can make donations for that. But today, starting today, we're going to ask that you sign up back there just to let them know how much food to prepare. Put down your family name and the number in your family that's going to be attending, and that way they'll have an idea of how many to prepare for. But really appreciate your support. Last year, I know you're going to come through and do a great job this year in making that success. And, we really depend upon your regular, faithful giving in the box in the back or online giving. That is what makes everything happen around here. But I know that it's no fun giving to the box, okay? It's a lot more fun when you give to a cause. And this is an opportunity for you to give to a cause. So I hope that you'll support that. All right, I'm going to date myself here and some of you as well. April 9th, 1970. Ooh, that's a blast in the past, isn't it? April 9th, 1970. Paul McCartney, in an interview, announced something. That the Beatles were no longer a group. It had been brewing internally for about a year, but now it was official. Now, for those of you who didn't grow up with the Beatles, you go, well, big deal. Let me tell you, this is the group that gave us Can't Buy Me Love, A Hard Day's Night. This is the group that performed, before anyone else ever did this, they performed in a stadium and filled 55,000 plus seats in a stadium. No group had ever done that before the Beatles did at Shea Stadium. And now the Beatles were history. It's ironic, about a year, 6 months prior to that, they recorded their final recording session, and the song that was their last song to record was a song entitled The End. Pretty telling about where this group was going. And if you weren't around then, and I was pretty young, I wasn't really, into, I was very young then. If you were around then, you can relate to this, that teenagers across the country wondered what the world was coming to. I mean, how could you live without the greatest rock band in history? What would they do without the Beatles? So let me ask you, have you ever felt something like that? Has your life's plans ever spun out of control? Has your assured path to happiness taken an unpredicted detour? And then you just ask yourself, what in the world am I going to do? That phrase, out of control, is a pretty telling phrase. I want you to just kind of rest on that for a few moments. Because we live most of our life with this sense of control, don't we? We set our alarm clocks. We know where we're going to go on Monday morning to work or to the coffee shop. We have our plans. I mean, everything is laid out. We're in control, or so we think. But there are moments in life where we are startled awake with the reminder that we are no longer in control. That things don't always go the way that we want them to go. It might be a cutback at work where your job has been eliminated and all of a sudden your whole career path takes a dramatic turn. It might be a friend who cuts you off out of the relationship, unfriends you for no reason, and you just wonder what in the world happened here to cause this deep, lasting friendship to fizzle. It might be a secret addiction that you have that was, intended at the very beginning to give you pleasure and happiness, but now all of a sudden it becomes your greatest source of pain, and you wonder, how in the world did I lose control over my life? Just months earlier, you said life was going just how I wanted to go. I was on the fast track to happiness and success, and now you realize I have no control over what's happening in my life. Well, I think that's how the Christians in Antioch must have felt. Paul and Barnabas had returned to Antioch to give a report about their first missionary trip into Asia. They didn't go far, but they went further than anyone had ever gone before, preaching in cities, towns. They visited many cities. They established churches, Christian communities in at least 5 of those cities out there, thriving Christian communities. And they came back and just was excited to report about all that was going on. And it says that Paul and Barnabas reported all that God had done through them. And just to think, if God had done that kind of amazing work through them in this initial outing, think what he has in store for the next time. How far they could go, how many people they could reach, how many churches they could establish, how great effect they could have on the growth and the expansion of the kingdom. I mean, Paul and Barnabas were poised to take the gospel across the entire Roman world, heading out west. So it must have come as a shock to them when they heard that Paul and Barnabas were dissolving their partnership. And let me tell you, it wasn't an amicable parting. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Acts chapter 15, verse 26 through 40. You've been in church for a while, you've read through this, and you might kind of treat it as just a transition statement that moves on to the next big thing that's happening. But today we're going to rest here about the big thing that's happening here. I'll read it to you. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let's go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in their work. And they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. 5 verses here in the middle of the book of Acts. But let me tell you, this turns out to be one of the biggest news events in the life of the early church. All right, let's kind of set the stage here. Mark was Barnabas's cousin. I mean, they were related. So he's got a heart for him, you know. Mark and his mom lived in Jerusalem. You remember when Peter was released from prison and went to meet with the believers meeting? And that was at John's house, at Mark's house, Mark's mom's house. That's where the Christians met. And so Barnabas knew Mark, he knew his mother. They were close. And so when Paul and Barnabas, collecting money up in Antioch to help the hurting churches in Jerusalem, traveled to Jerusalem to give them the gift, they met, probably stayed there at Mark's house. And Barnabas decided, hey, it's probably good for Mark to come with us to, learn what it's like to be a Christian man. And so travel with us for a while. And Mark was probably all into that, and Mark's mom was probably definitely all into that, okay? So Mark traveled with Barnabas and Paul. They went back up to Antioch. It was there in Antioch where the Holy Spirit said, hey, set apart Barnabas and Paul for the mission I have for them. And because Mark was Barnabas's responsibility, Mark went along as well. So on this first missionary journey, it was not just Paul and Barnabas, it was Paul and Barnabas and Mark traveling, at least for a while. It was there in Pamphylia. It was just the first seacoast town past Cyprus that it said that John left, they call him John or Mark, John left to return to Jerusalem. That's how Luke describes it. John left to return to Jerusalem. That's not how Paul describes it. Paul says John deserted us. Let me tell you, that's strong language to use about a family member of your coworker, of your teammate. But that's what he felt. John had deserted us. When we needed him the most, he quit and he ran. And in fact, that was such a strong words, strong conflict, that Luke says it led to a, here's his words, sharp disagreement between Barnabas and Paul. I got to tell you, that term sharp disagreement doesn't convey fully what's going on here. The word that's used there carries with it the meaning of an intense emotional turmoil or a loud, impassioned argument. I know we don't really like to think about Christian people having loud, impassioned arguments. But that's clearly what Barnabas and Paul were engaged in here. The Message, which is not a translation, it's a paraphrase, but I like what it says here. The Message says this: tempers flared. I go, yeah, that's probably what happened here. Tempers flared. Once Paul said, your cousin deserted us, it was all in, right? And so much so that they decided we just can't work together. There is no compromising on this point here. And so Barnabas took Mark and headed south towards Cyprus. And Paul took Silas and headed north. Two different directions. At first glance, it looks like a tragic end to a promising team. And you got to wonder, why in the world did Luke include this story in his account? I mean, it's got to be more than just to tell you that the roster's changed, okay? A good PR man here would have worded it a lot differently. It would have said something like, it was a mutual agreement, benefiting the greater good. We wish one another well. You know the language, right? Luke doesn't pull any punches. Paul and Barnabas had a heated conflict, and it ultimately led them to breaking up their shared mission. So, why do we have this story here? These 5 verses, to me, tell me something about what I need to know when my grand plans fall apart. When I suddenly find myself out of control. And the key to that lesson is in verse 40. Here's what it says. Latter half of that verse. Paul chose Silas and set out, commended to the grace of the Lord by the brothers and sisters. When the church at Antioch finally came to grips that Paul and Barnabas were no longer to be a missionary team, that their conflict was so insurmountable that they had to choose other partners and go their separate ways and do the work they needed to do. Luke says this church at Antioch, which was a sending church, a missionary church, this church commended these new teams to the grace of the Lord. What does that mean? The Greek term there conveys this idea that the church gave them over to the Lord. That the church entrusted these new teams to the Lord. It's as if they were saying, this new arrangement is not our choice. We would have chosen a much different outcome. But since this is the outcome, we're going to entrust its success into the hands of the Lord. They realized that they no longer had control over the situation. And so they trusted the Lord's power and his grace, that those things combined could turn what looked like a tragedy into something glorious. And those two ideas echo in my mind. They trusted God's power, and they also trusted his graciousness. They found comfort knowing that in a realm where we are no longer in control, God is always in control. And that his good plans are invincible. Nothing can deter them. And it says they sent them out. Weeks earlier, they had envisioned what this new future would look like. Paul and Barnabas going further west, doing great things for the kingdom. And now they're saying, you know what? This is in God's hands. He is able and he is gracious enough to take what we may view as a loss and turn it into his personal victory. So I think at times we need to ask ourselves those same questions. Do I believe that God is still in control? When it seems like no one's in control, do I trust that God is in control? Proverbs 19 says this: many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Tell you what, that is beautiful when it's embroidered on a pillow, cross-stitched on a pillow. It's something else when I have to swallow it, right? When I have to ask myself, do I believe that? And the second one is this: do I believe that ultimately God will fulfill his good promises? That even though at the moment it looks like God's great plans for my life, for my future, are falling apart, that somehow in this circuitous route, God is going to bring about the good that he has always willed for himself and for me. Romans 8 says this: we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who've been called according to his purpose. And we see those two truths, that God is powerful and that God is gracious, played out in the life of Jesus. Joseph and Mary have this newborn baby, the Messiah, gifted to them. Beautiful, beautiful moment as you read through Luke about what's happening here. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of all of this, Herod sending his goons down to Bethlehem in order to find the child and murder the child. Now, we read that, and we already know the outcome, so we're not worried about it at all. I'll tell you what, Joseph and Mary were worried about it. And they must have also been asking, what in the world is going on here? God's plan was for something else to happen, and now we're facing the possible death of this child we're responsible for. And while God didn't instigate Herod's paranoia and his anger, God says, I've got a purpose for it. You see, Jesus had to fulfill the Old Testament prophecies. And so in Hosea, when Hosea says in a prophetic voice about the Messiah, out of Egypt I will call my son, God says, I've got to get Jesus down to Egypt somehow. And so he uses Herod's rage and his anger in order to make what had to happen, happen. And when Jesus is overcome with grief in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's praying, please, Father, just remove this cup from me. 3 times he prays. And again, we know the end of the story, so we say, don't worry about it. But Jesus is worrying about it right here, right? And there's a sense for, if you didn't know the story, there'd be the sense of us sitting there going, what in the world's going on here? If God had great plans for sending his son, something is off track. And as he's pouring sweat like blood in the garden here, Jesus finally confesses, "Not my will, but yours be done." You don't say something like that unless you trust that God has the power to control things that seem out of control. And that God is gracious enough to fulfill the promises that he laid out from the very beginning. And it's worth noting here that God's good plans did not mean protecting Jesus from the suffering that was ahead for him. He still went to the cross. He still was abused by the soldiers. He was facing injustice of the rulers, the ridicule of the crowds. But as he went to the cross, he went there with a different perspective on things. Not as this is a painful result of an out-of-control world. He went to the cross seeing it as suffering with a purpose. That God was going to do something great through this. And so he trusted that God would somehow, in the midst of pain and hardship, and ridicule and rejection, that God would somehow exalt him through that and defeat the satanic force that seemed totally in control at the moment. And so as he hung on the cross, he quietly whispers, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." It's like he's saying, I am not in control, but I trust that you are. And you know what? God proved that true in the story of Barnabas and Paul. It might have looked like the breakup of Barnabas and Paul was a tragedy, but now we look back at it and we see God's power and his goodness at work in the midst of that. Paul and Silas completed the second and the third missionary trips. He reached out into Greece and Macedonia, and later on Paul even went to Rome and even further to Spain. And we know less about what happened to Barnabas and Mark, but historical records show us that Mark eventually went down into the city of Alexandria in Egypt and established the very first church there. And although Paul would later admit, Mark is pretty helpful to me, there's a lot more to this story than just Paul admitting that Mark had more promise than he first thought. It's about God reminding us that no matter what happens in our lives, no matter what unexpected hurdles we may face, God is in control, and he promises to work out his good will in our lives. I don't know where you are today, but if your life seems out of control, if you've made some costly mistakes, or even if despite your best efforts your plans seem to fall apart, maybe it's time to come to God and find peace in him. No personal failure robs God of his power over your life if you turn to him. No tragic turn of event weakens God's ability to work out his good will in your life. On the day of Pentecost, Peter speaks to the thousands that are gathered there. 3,000 come and respond to his plea. And as he's making this presentation, he says some pretty curious things, talking about the story that everyone knew, the death and the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. He says, this was not an accident. This was God's predetermined plan. that God raised him up, that God released him from the pains of death because, here's the phrase, it was impossible for him to be held in its power. A month and a half earlier, the story didn't look nearly as promising. But Peter says, as if he knew all along, Peter says, I've learned one thing. Even when things look impossibly tragic, it is impossible for God's will and plan for us to be held in the power of death and destruction. And so he urged the crowd. He said, look, if you want that hope, you need to come to Jesus. You need to confess him as the Lord of your life. You need to repent of a self-directed future that seeks to find personal control over my life. And you need to learn to trust that God is able and he is willing to work out his good will in all of our lives. To unburden you from all the what could have beens, and to ask Jesus to show you what can be. And that's why we meet, and that's why we sing, and that's why we invite you to find that hope. The song we're going to sing says it all. This is a season for a new anointing. This is the season for a fresh outpouring so that the sons and daughters of the King of Glory can arise and can shine. Today is your day to rise again. Today is your day to shine. And if you aren't in that kind of relationship with Jesus, this song is your invitation to discover that today. If you need to, come down front or speak to one of our shepherds in the back as we sing this song together.